At 69, I stopped funding my own disrespect. Last Tuesday, I made one quiet change to my banking details, no drama, no warning. 2 hours later, my front door was kicked open. My daughter and her husband stormed in furious over a debit card that had suddenly failed at a luxury dealership. He demanded my new PIN like it still belonged to him. I didn't stand up. I didn't argue. I held my coffee, met his eyes, and said one calm sentence. That was the moment control shifted, and they felt it. I appreciate you spending your time here. Comment where you're watching from so we can connect across the world. Please remember, some elements are fictional for storytelling and education. Any similarities to real individuals or places are unintentional, but the lesson behind this story truly matters. The doorframe exploded inward, with a violent crack, splinters of painted wood scattering like shrapnel across my hardwood floor. Thin curls of white paint drifted down onto the polished surface I had cleaned just that morning. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I remained seated at my small kitchen table, both hands wrapped steadily around a ceramic mug of black coffee, the warmth grounding me in the middle of the chaos. Bryce burst in first. His face was flushed, a deep, furious purple, thick veins straining against the collar of his tailored designer shirt. His jaw twitched with barely contained rage. Behind him, Brianna stumbled into the room, breathing too fast. Her fingers gripping a leather handbag so tightly, her knuckles had turned pale. It was an expensive bag. I recognized it immediately. I had paid for it without ever setting foot in the store. Bryce skipped any pretense of civility. He did not greet me. He did not ask a question. He slammed his fist down onto my kitchen table so hard the coffee leapt from the rim of my mug and splashed onto my knuckles, the heat biting into my skin. I felt the sting, but showed no reaction. He leaned across the table until his face was inches from mine. His breath carried the sharp scent of premium espresso and unrestrained fury. He shouted that he had just been humiliated at the finance desk of a luxury European auto dealership downtown. He had been prepared to put down a $10,000 cash deposit on a brand new sports utility vehicle. A top-tier model, fully upgraded. While waiting for paperwork, he had walked to the lobby ATM to pull a cash advance using my debit card. The machine swallowed it instantly. The screen flashed a warning: account permanently closed due to suspected fraud. According to him, the salesman had stared as though he were a petty thief caught mid-scam. Bryce thrust his open palm toward my face, fingers rigid and demanding. He wanted the new banking card. He wanted the updated personal identification number. He wanted them immediately, so he could rush back downtown and secure the vehicle before someone else purchased it. Brianna hovered behind him, nodding urgently, her voice thin and anxious. The dealership would not hold the SUV much longer, she insisted. They needed to hurry. This was important. I did not raise my voice. I did not tremble. I set my mug down carefully. I reached for a paper napkin and dabbed the coffee from my knuckles with deliberate slowness. Then I looked up at both of them and allowed silence to stretch between us. Silence has weight. I let it settle into the room until Brianna shifted uneasily on her feet. 3 years earlier, I had stood at my wife's graveside, the soil still freshly turned. Brianna had wept into my coat and begged me not to live alone in the big house anymore. She had pleaded with me to move into the guest house on her property. She promised she would take care of me. She told me I would never have to worry about meals or errands again. In my grief, I agreed. She had asked for my debit card, explaining that she would handle groceries so I would not have to drive while mourning. I trusted my only child. I handed her the plastic card connected to my monthly pension, $5,500 deposited with quiet reliability every 4 weeks. Now I looked at her and asked a simple question. What had she bought me for dinner this week? The question landed harder than any accusation. She blinked, startled by the shift. Her eyes flicked toward Bryce, searching for rescue. She mumbled that she had dropped off groceries on Monday. I rose from my chair and crossed the 4 short steps to my pantry. I opened the door wide. Inside sat 3 dented cans of generic chicken soup and a half-empty box of stale crackers. Nothing more. I stepped aside so they could see clearly. Then I turned back toward them and spoke calmly, stating only facts. Over the past 12 months alone, more than $60,000 had flowed into that account. 60,000. I gestured toward the cans. Was this what $60,000 purchased in today's economy? Bryce rolled his eyes with theatrical exaggeration. He exhaled loudly, as if burdened by my unreasonable behavior. He accused me of being dramatic. He said I did not require much money anyway. According to him, I spent my days sitting quietly in the guest house doing nothing of consequence. He reminded me that they were doing me a favor by allowing me to live on their property. Then he slapped the table again, irritation flaring. He said we were wasting valuable time discussing canned soup while his luxury vehicle reservation was at risk. I listened without interruption. Then I walked toward the small bookshelf in the corner of my living room. The shelf held decades of structural engineering textbooks, manuals filled with calculations and load-bearing diagrams from a life spent building foundations that would not fail. Behind those books, hidden from casual view, sat a massive black binder. I pulled it free. It was heavy, dense, deliberate. I carried it back to the kitchen table and dropped it directly in front of Bryce. The thud reverberated through the small room with quiet authority. Dust shifted slightly from the worn cover. I opened the binder slowly. Inside were printed bank statements organized chronologically. Highlighted transactions, itemized expenditures, copies of receipts. Notes written in precise, measured handwriting. A forensic accounting of every dollar withdrawn, transferred, or spent over the past 3 years. VIP cabanas in Miami. 5-star steakhouse dinners, designer jewelry purchases, luxury boutique transactions, resort deposits, flights, all while I stood in front of dented soup cans. I did not shout. I did not accuse. I simply turned the first page toward them and allowed the numbers to speak. For 40 years, I had calculated stress tolerances and fracture points. I understood exactly how much weight a structure could bear before collapsing. That morning in my small kitchen, I was no longer calculating bridges. I was calculating betrayal. Inside the binder were hundreds of meticulously organized pages, bank statements, marked in yellow highlighter forensic accounting notes in my precise handwriting, and printed photographs of receipts and transaction confirmations. Every withdrawal, every indulgence, every lie documented in black ink. I met Bryce's eyes and spoke without raising my voice. The account, I told him, was not suffering from a technical glitch. At 8 o'clock that very morning, I had walked into my local bank branch in person. I had closed the account permanently. I had redirected every future pension deposit to a private financial institution, one protected by layers of security neither he nor Brianna would ever penetrate. For a moment, silence hovered between us. Then Bryce scoffed, shaking his head with theatrical disbelief. He called me a paranoid old fool. He insisted the money had only been used for necessary property upkeep, lawn maintenance, repairs, utilities. He spoke as though he were reciting a well-rehearsed script. I calmly turned to the first tab in the binder. Then I began to read. My voice did not waver. It carried the measured cadence of a verdict being delivered in a courtroom. I read the exact date and timestamp of a $4,000 charge for a VIP cabana in Miami, booked during the very week I lay alone in the guest house recovering from pneumonia, struggling to breathe through fever and isolation. I continued. $300 charges at a high-end steakhouse downtown, weekly, consistent, predictable. The same evenings, Brianna had texted me apologetically, claiming they were both working late and unable to bring me dinner. I turned the page. There it was, the itemized receipt for a diamond tennis bracelet, purchased with funds explicitly designated for my supplemental health insurance coverage. The description of the bracelet shimmered on paper, elegant custom-set premium clarity stones. I kept reading, line after line, dollar after dollar. Luxury resort deposits, boutique hotel suites, premium airline upgrades, designer boutiques, spa packages, weekend retreats, every expense documented with cold precision. The pattern was undeniable. They had not borrowed. They had not miscalculated. They had systematically siphoned my life savings to fund an inflated lifestyle, while relegating me to canned soup and stale crackers like an afterthought stored in the backyard. When I finished, I closed the binder gently. The sound was soft, but final. I told them the gravy train had derailed. Permanently. Not another cent of my pension would ever pass through their hands again. And if they did not leave my home immediately, I would contact the authorities and report 3 years of elder financial exploitation. I expected collapse. I expected Brianna to break into tears. I expected Bryce to feel the first tremor of fear. I expected panic to replace arrogance. I was wrong. Bryce did not flinch. He did not retreat. Instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across his face, calculated predatory. He reached inside his tailored jacket and withdrew a thin manila folder. It was unmarked. Unassuming. He dropped it onto my binder with a flick of his wrist. The smile remained. He leaned forward, confidence fully restored, and informed me that I would not be calling the police, nor would I be keeping my money. He had anticipated this confrontation, he said. He had prepared for it. He tapped the folder. Inside, he explained, was a drafted petition for full involuntary conservatorship. Over the past 6 months, he and Brianna had been carefully documenting what they described as my cognitive decline. He claimed I had become paranoid, forgetful, unstable. He smiled, sweet, artificial, rehearsed. Then he delivered the true blow. He had already retained a private physician, a doctor I had never met. That physician had signed a sworn medical affidavit declaring I was suffering from rapid-onset dementia. According to the document, I was legally incapable of managing my finances or making rational life decisions. The room seemed to narrow. Brianna finally spoke, her voice coated in syrupy sympathy. She said it was for my own protection. She said my accusations proved my mind was deteriorating. She said a judge would see my age, see the affidavit, and grant them full authority over my estate, my health decisions, my assets, my autonomy. She spoke gently, as though explaining something reasonable to a child. Bryce checked his gold watch. Then he issued his ultimatum. I had 24 hours. If I voluntarily surrendered the new bank card, disclosed the PIN, and signed a general power of attorney transferring control of my finances to him, they would allow me to remain in the guest house. If I refused, he would file the petition first thing in the morning. Once the judge signed the emergency order, my accounts would be frozen, my property access revoked. I would be removed legally and forcibly and placed in a state-run nursing facility of his choosing. He described it with detached clarity, heavily medicated, minimal supervision forgotten. He said I would spend the remainder of my life there. Bryce stepped back from the table. He grabbed Brianna by the arm and turned toward the broken doorway. Brianna did not meet my eyes. They walked out together, leaving the splintered door hanging crookedly on its hinges. Cold afternoon wind swept through my kitchen, carrying the faint smell of dust and distant traffic. They believed they had cornered a helpless old man. They believed fear would force surrender. They mistook silence for weakness. And that miscalculation would become the fatal flaw in their foundation. They believed they had cornered a frail, confused old man with nowhere left to turn. They imagined I would spend the night pacing the floor, hands shaking, waiting for morning so I could surrender. They mistook stillness for weakness. They did not understand that my silence was not fear. It was calculation. It was the quiet mind of a structural engineer identifying stress fractures in a failing system, mapping load points, isolating weaknesses, and determining exactly where to apply pressure so the entire structure would collapse under its own corruption. I stood alone in the center of my kitchen, the cold wind slipping through the splintered doorframe. Bryce's engine roared briefly, then faded as he drove away, confident in his victory. The house settled into an uneasy stillness. Many men my age might have lowered themselves into a chair and wept. Some might have reached for the telephone calling a friend, for comfort confessing betrayal in a broken voice. Some might have surrendered to the crushing humiliation of being threatened by their own flesh and blood. I did none of those things. For 40 years, I designed structures meant to withstand earthquakes, hurricanes, and the slow erosion of time. I calculated tensile strength compression thresholds and the precise moment a foundation would buckle under sustained pressure. I learned that collapse never happens without warning. There are always signs, microfractures invisible to the untrained eye. Bryce's confidence was too smooth, his timeline too rehearsed. 24 hours was not a spontaneous ultimatum. It was a scheduled maneuver. The pension had only been the visible crack in the plaster. The real objective lay beneath the surface. If they were willing to fabricate medical evidence and hire a corrupt physician to declare me legally incompetent, then they were not interested in monthly deposits alone. They were targeting the whole structure, the estate, the land, the investments, the authority to liquidate everything I had built across decades. They did not simply want access, they wanted ownership. They wanted to reduce my existence to paperwork signed under duress. I had constructed a fortress for my daughter. Now her husband intended to lock me in its dungeon. I walked into my bedroom without hesitation. I pulled on my heavy wool coat, the weight of it grounding my focus. I picked up my car keys from the nightstand. 23 hours remained. No more. I backed my vintage car out of the driveway and headed toward the financial district. The drive lasted 35 minutes, each mile passing in disciplined silence. I did not turn on the radio. I did not allow distraction. The quiet inside the vehicle mirrored the clarity settling over my thoughts. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a coordinated assault. The glass tower rose against the skyline like a blade of steel. I parked in the underground garage and rode the elevator to the 42nd floor. The brass lettering on the double doors gleamed Crow and Associates. Frederick Crow did not specialize in reconciliation. He specialized in destruction, corporate takeovers, hostile asset disputes, dismantling fraudulent claims with surgical precision. A decade earlier, I had retained him to construct my trust. He had done so with ruthless efficiency. Today I required that same ruthlessness. The receptionist began to speak, but one look at my face silenced her. I walked past her desk and opened Frederick's office door without knocking. He looked up from his screen, his eyes narrowed behind wire-rimmed glasses. Without a word, he closed his laptop and gestured to the leather chair opposite him. I did not waste time on pleasantries. I placed both hands flat against his desk and told him everything: the forged affidavit, the conservatorship threat, the 24-hour deadline. Frederick did not react emotionally. He did not express outrage or sympathy. He reached for a legal pad and began writing. "Timeline," he said. I provided it. He underlined 3 words twice. Then he leaned back and tapped the pen against his chin. "In this state," he said evenly, "an emergency temporary conservatorship can be granted quickly if a sworn physician claims cognitive impairment, especially if the petitioner alleges the subject poses a danger to himself. If granted, Bryce would immediately control my finances. He could freeze accounts, change locks, redirect mail, and forcibly relocate me to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. Frederick met my eyes. "This isn't a family argument," he said. "This is a legal ambush." He picked up his phone and called his senior paralegal. He ordered an immediate background sweep on every filing under Bryce's name across all counties. He wanted the doctor's identity. He wanted documentation trails. While we waited, Frederick accessed my estate records. The deed to the main property appeared on his monitors. 15 years ago, I had purchased that house outright in cash. I placed the deeds solely in my name, not to control my daughter, but to protect her. If her marriage ever failed, the house would remain secure. Bryce had never appreciated that detail. Frederick initiated a real-time title audit, the office filled with the rapid rhythm of keystrokes. Then abruptly, he stopped. The cursor blinked on the screen. His jaw tightened. He rotated the monitor toward me. A newly registered lien had been recorded against the property 3 weeks prior. The words sat there in stark clarity. Lien. Bryce had not merely siphoned pension funds. He had leveraged the land itself. He had found a method to bypass direct title ownership and borrow against the property's equity. The battlefield widened instantly. The dollar figure glowed beneath the entry 6 digits. A staggering amount. Hundreds of thousands. The strategy crystallized. He intended to secure as much capital as possible before neutralizing me through conservatorship. Once declared incompetent, I would have no access, no authority, no awareness. He would control everything. I stared at the word lien, struggling to reconcile it with memory. 15 years earlier, I had walked into a real estate office and written a certified cashier's check covering the full purchase price. No mortgage, no debt, no bank oversight. Brianna had been anxious about long-term financial burdens. I removed them entirely. I wanted her to sleep peacefully, knowing the house could never be repossessed. It was meant to be permanent. Now, somehow, a financial institution had inserted itself between the land and its rightful owner. Frederick opened the filing. It was a home equity line of credit substantial aggressive. The paperwork bore my name as guarantor, my signature. Except it wasn't mine. Even before Frederick spoke, I knew. For decades, I drafted blueprints by hand. My signature was consistent, angled, precisely pressure, uniform, spacing, deliberate. The signature on the screen leaned unevenly, strokes, hesitant pen pressure, inconsistent. A forgery. Frederick confirmed it with quiet precision. Such a loan required falsified income documentation, tax statements, and the cooperation or negligence of a notary. This was no impulsive act. It was layered fraud. Bryce had borrowed against the land without my consent. If he defaulted, foreclosure proceedings would initiate in my name. The conservatorship threat now made sense. If declared incompetent, I would never see default notices. He could intercept communication, liquidate assets, and disappear before I understood the collapse. It was elegant in its cruelty, and it would have worked if I had waited. Frederick began outlining immediate countermeasures. We would need certified proof of my competency. We would need to challenge the affidavit preemptively. We would need to freeze financial movement before capital vanished. Time was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. And for the first time since Bryce kicked down my door, I felt something unexpected. Not fear, resolve. They had underestimated the man they attempted to bury. They saw age and assumed fragility. They mistook quiet observation for decline. But I had spent my life studying collapse, and I knew exactly how to bring one. 15 years ago, I handed Brianna the keys to that house with a completely clean title. There was no mortgage, no bank underwriting, no corporate lender lurking behind the paperwork. I had written a certified cashier's check for the full purchase price. The soil, the framing, the concrete slab, the roof line, every inch of it belonged solely to me. And now, seated in my attorney's corner office, 42 floors above the city, I was staring at a digital county record stating that a massive financial institution held a legal claim against that very property. It felt like discovering rust in steel I had personally inspected. "Open the filing," I told Frederick. "I need to see exactly what he did." Frederick did not offer comfort. He did not waste time condemning Bryce's behavior. He simply turned back to his monitors and entered his secure credentials into the county clerk's database. The login screen dissolved into a stark white interface. A small circular icon began spinning. It spun and spun. Each rotation seemed to stretch longer than the last. I remained perfectly still in the leather guest chair, my back straight, my hands resting calmly on my knees. But beneath that stillness, something cold and heavy settled into the center of my chest. It was not panic. I have known panic. This was different. It was the sensation I used to feel, standing beneath a bridge I had helped design, when I noticed a hairline fracture in a primary support column that no one else had seen. That precise, nauseating recognition that collapse was no longer theoretical. It was inevitable. The document finally loaded. A scanned, notarized loan agreement filled the screen. Frederick enlarged it until the black text consumed the entire monitor. I leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the desk. It was an official home equity line of credit. Bryce had used the house as collateral, my house, to open a direct line of liquid cash. Frederick's cursor hovered over the principal amount approved by the underwriter, $300,000. For a fraction of a second, my breath caught. 300,000. Bryce had quietly extracted a fortune from the very walls I purchased to protect my daughter. Frederick scrolled through page after page of dense legal language. Standard clauses, adjustable interest provisions, default penalties, acceleration triggers. The tone was clinical, unforgiving. He explained evenly that a home equity line of credit functions like an enormous credit card tethered directly to the property's market value. If payments are missed, foreclosure proceedings begin aggressively. The bank does not negotiate sentiment. It takes the house. Bryce had effectively strapped a timed explosive to my daughter's living room. "I am the sole legal owner," I said. "How does a federally regulated institution approve a loan of that magnitude without my physical presence or consent?" Frederick did not answer immediately. He scrolled further down. Then he stopped. The signature page filled the screen. 3 signature lines. Primary applicant, co-applicant, guarantor, and legal property owner. That third line was meant for me. I leaned closer. My full legal name was printed neatly above the signature line, Richard Alexander Winslow, and beneath it, ink. I stared at it. A calm, absolute clarity washed over me. It was not my handwriting. For decades, I drafted blueprints by hand before the industry digitized. My pen strokes were precise. My capital letters carried sharp angles at the apex. My lowercase letters were uniform, evenly spaced, disciplined. The signature on the screen leaned too far to the right. The pressure fluctuated inconsistently. The loops hesitated. Whoever signed it had paused repeatedly, likely glancing at a reference sample. It was an imitation. A sloppy one. "It's forged," I said quietly. I pointed out the inconsistencies the way I would explain a failed concrete pour to a construction crew without emotion, only mechanics. Stroke weight, angle deviation, rhythm breaks. Frederick nodded slowly. "To execute this level of fraud," he said, "requires coordination." Bryce had not simply scribbled my name at a kitchen table. He would have needed falsified income statements, fabricated tax returns, and most critically, a notary willing to stamp the document. Frederick tapped the blurred blue seal beside my forged signature. He copied the notary's name onto his legal pad. "This," he said evenly, "is no longer a pension dispute. This is federal bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, conspiracy, felonies. Mandatory sentencing. The pieces of Bryce's strategy aligned with brutal clarity. The 24-hour ultimatum. The fake dementia diagnosis. The conservatorship threat. He was not trying to secure my future pension payments. He had already taken $300,000, and I suspected it was gone. He's maxed it out, I said. Frederick's eyes lifted. He's spent it, I continued. Vacations, vehicles, lifestyle. The monthly interest alone would be suffocating. A loan of that size carries enormous interest obligations. Miss a payment, and the bank sends a formal default notice to the legal owner. To me, the entire scheme would unravel the moment I saw that notice, unless I was legally declared incompetent. If Bryce succeeded in securing emergency conservatorship, he would intercept my mail, freeze my accounts, control my communications. He could quietly liquidate assets to cover his tracks while I was confined somewhere I could not fight back. A psychiatric ward, a locked facility, drugged into submission. The cruelty of it was almost elegant. The most devastating realization was not the money. It was Brianna. I leaned back and stared through the massive office window at the gray skyline. An hour earlier, she had stood in my kitchen, while her husband threatened to institutionalize me. She had nodded along. She had called me unstable. Did she know about the forged loan? Or had she only participated in draining my pension? The answer no longer mattered. She had chosen her side. She had stood beside a man threatening to strip her father of autonomy, dignity, and legal rights. Whatever fragile illusion of family remained dissolved in that office. What replaced it was something colder. Resolve. I turned back to Frederick. I don't just want to stop the conservatorship, I said. I want to dismantle everything. Frederick smiled for the first time since I entered. It was not warm. It was sharp. To dismantle them, he said, we must first fortify you. The forged signature was powerful evidence. But if a corrupt judge granted emergency conservatorship in the morning, my accounts would freeze instantly, including my ability to retain Frederick. Time was critical. What's the next move? I asked. Frederick glanced at the wall clock. 3 p.m. You're undergoing the most rigorous cognitive evaluation available in this state, he said. Tonight. He explained that we needed indisputable medical documentation, proving full mental competency, certified court-admissible bulletproof. If Bryce presented a fraudulent affidavit tomorrow, we would counter it with superior, expedited expert testimony. Frederick picked up his phone and dialed a private medical clinic authorized by the state Supreme Court to conduct emergency evaluations. He spoke in clipped, decisive sentences. I need a comprehensive neurocognitive assessment, he said. Full battery, IQ metrics, memory retention, executive function, psychiatric screening, tonight. He paused, listening. Yes, he continued. Expedited certification. Before sunrise. He ended the call and met my eyes. They can see you at 6. That left 3 hours. In that window, Frederick initiated additional countermeasures. He contacted a forensic document examiner to prepare an affidavit analyzing the forged signature. He instructed his team to draft a motion challenging any emergency conservatorship filing as fraudulent and retaliatory. Simultaneously, his paralegal called back. She had identified the notary, a history of prior complaints, irregular filings, possible criminal investigation pending. Frederick wrote the information down carefully. The house, he said quietly, is still yours. The lien can be challenged. But we need speed. I nodded. For the first time since Bryce kicked down my door, I felt something shift internally. Not fear, not anger. Focus. They had underestimated the foundation they were attempting to erode. I had spent my career analyzing structural failure. I understood precisely how overconfidence leads to collapse. Bryce believed he had built a perfect trap fraudulent loan corrupt doctor emergency petition. But he miscalculated one variable. He assumed I would freeze. He assumed I would tremble. Instead, I was already reinforcing the load-bearing walls. At 6 o'clock that evening, I would sit before a panel of specialists and demonstrate line by line, test by test, that my mind was sharper than ever. By sunrise, I would hold certified proof of competence, and when Bryce attempted to weaponize falsehood in a courthouse the next morning, he would discover that the structure he built on forgery and arrogance could not withstand scrutiny. He believed he was burying me. In reality, he had just exposed himself to federal prosecution. The legal battlefield had expanded, and I was no longer reacting. I was engineering the collapse. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, I was seated in the sterile waiting room of the Cognitive Evaluation Center. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow across the polished tile floor. I had not slept for a single minute. The night before, I remained at my small kitchen table revisiting decades of structural equations and engineering principles, from memory wind load calculations, stress tolerances, prime factor decompositions. Not because I doubted my mind, but because I refused to allow even the smallest crack to form under pressure. I was not about to let a greedy son-in-law strip me of my dignity with a fabricated diagnosis. A young nurse in pale blue scrubs stepped through the double doors and called my name. Her voice was soft, neutral. She led me down a long, white corridor that smelled faintly of antiseptic. The hallway felt intentionally disorienting. No windows, no artwork, no sound beyond the echo of our footsteps. At the end of the corridor, she opened a door to a windowless examination room. 3 physicians sat behind a long folding table. They were members of the state-appointed Independent Medical Board. Their responsibility was clear: determine whether an elderly citizen retained the cognitive capacity to manage his own life, or whether his rights should be transferred to a legal guardian. The lead doctor was a stern woman with sharp eyes and a metal clipboard balanced on her lap. She spoke in precise, measured tones. The evaluation, she explained, would last approximately 4 hours. It would test memory retention, spatial awareness, advanced problem-solving, executive reasoning, and emotional stability. The structure of the exam was designed to induce mental fatigue, frustration, cognitive strain. The goal, she said plainly, was to reveal hidden weaknesses. I met her gaze and offered a small, calm smile. For 40 years, I said, I calculated wind shear resistance on steel suspension bridges, while city contractors screamed and supply chains collapsed. Mental fatigue was a Tuesday. She did not smile in return. She set a heavy silver stopwatch on the table and pressed start. The interrogation began. They opened with memory recall. The second physician read aloud a list of 30 random unrelated words. Apple lantern, graphite, ocean, silk corridor, each delivered at a steady pace. I was instructed to repeat them back exactly 1 hour later in precise order. I closed my eyes briefly as he spoke, constructing a mental lattice and internal grid where each word anchored itself in sequence. 30 words. 30 structural nodes. Then came spatial reasoning. A thick packet of complex geometric figures was placed in front of me, 3-dimensional shapes flattened onto paper. I was asked to mentally rotate them and match each to its corresponding shadow from a selection of nearly identical options. It was frankly insulting. I spent decades drafting load-bearing schematics by hand before computer software existed. I visualized entire bridge spans in 3 dimensions while calculating torsional stress in real time. I completed the entire packet in under 5 minutes. The second doctor quietly retrieved the pages. He compared my responses to the answer key. His eyebrow lifted. He reviewed again. No errors. Next came rapid sequential subtraction, prime numbers descending from a 5-digit starting figure. No paper, no calculator, only mental arithmetic. I did not hesitate. The numbers flowed with mechanical rhythm, precise and unbroken. I spoke them aloud at steady intervals like a metronome marking time. The third hour shifted tone entirely. This portion was psychological, conversational. They were not testing memory now. They were probing perception, emotional stability, delusion versus fact. The lead doctor folded her hands. "Why do you believe your family is attempting to steal from you?" she asked evenly. "Are you hearing voices?" she added. "Have you seen things others cannot see?" The questions were not hostile. They were procedural, but they carried weight. I leaned forward slightly in my chair. My voice remained calm, measured, clinical. Over the last 24 hours, I explained I had personally closed my primary bank account after discovering irregular withdrawals tied to my pension. I provided exact figures, exact dates. I described the fraudulent home equity line of credit in the amount of $300,000 secured against a property solely titled in my name. I detailed how my signature had been forged and how my attorney had identified the notary public responsible. I spoke without embellishment, without anger. I stated that my attorney, Frederick Crowe, was preparing to subpoena these medical records as part of a federal bank fraud and identity theft prosecution. The room shifted. The third doctor stopped writing mid-sentence. The second lowered his pen slowly. The lead physician's expression tightened not with suspicion but with concentration. They were no longer observing a confused old man. They were listening to a witness. They began asking more precise questions. "What is the name of your attorney, Frederick Crowe? Date of the loan filing?" 3 weeks ago, recorded with the county clerk. Exact date available in court filing. Amount approved, $300,000. Home equity line of credit. They tested for inconsistency. I offered none. They circled back to the memory recall. "Repeat the list of 30 words," the second doctor said. I recited them in exact order. No pause. No deviation. The stopwatch continued ticking on the table. By the fourth hour, fatigue began to settle into the room, but not into me. They layered complex logic puzzles with rapid-fire questioning designed to provoke irritation. I answered each calmly. Finally, the lead physician pressed the stopwatch. Silence filled the room. She exchanged a glance with the other two doctors. Then she closed her clipboard. "Mr. Winslow," she said, her tone no longer neutral, "there is no clinical evidence of cognitive decline." The words landed with quiet force. She continued, stating formally that my memory retention, executive reasoning, spatial analysis, and emotional regulation all ranked significantly above average for my age demographic. The evaluation would be documented immediately. Certified, court admissible. For the first time that morning, I allowed myself a slow breath. This was not merely a test of intelligence, it was a firewall. Bryce had attempted to engineer my erasure through false diagnosis and legal manipulation. Instead, he had triggered the most thorough cognitive examination available in the state. And I had passed it without a fracture. When I stood to leave the room, the doctors did not look at me as a man to be pitied. They looked at me as a man fully aware of what had been done to him, and fully prepared to respond. The fourth and final hour arrived. The lead doctor asked me to recite the 30 random words she had given me at the very beginning of the evaluation. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I recited all 30 words perfectly. Then I recited them in reverse alphabetical order just to make my point absolutely clear. The stopwatch clicked off. The three doctors gathered their papers and left the room to deliberate in private. I sat alone in the quiet white room for 20 agonizing minutes. I listened to the low hum of the fluorescent lights above me. I felt a profound sense of peace settling over my chest. I knew exactly who I was, and I knew exactly what my mind was capable of achieving. The door finally opened, and the lead doctor walked back in. She was no longer stern or clinical. She looked at me with a mixture of profound respect and genuine shock. She placed a heavy stack of papers on the desk directly in front of me. It was the official medical affidavit. She looked me in the eyes and told me I had scored in the 99th percentile for cognitive function. She said my spatial reasoning and mathematical logic were significantly better than most graduate students she evaluated on a daily basis. She formally declared that I was completely, entirely, and legally competent to manage my own affairs, my own finances, and my massive estate. She signed her name at the bottom of the document in thick black ink. The two other doctors walked in and signed their names right below hers. The lead doctor stamped the paper with the official raised seal of the state medical board, making it an undeniable legal fact. She handed the document to me and told me she wished me the absolute best of luck in putting my son-in-law exactly where he belonged. I walked out of the medical center at 10 o'clock in the morning. The bright morning sun hit my face, warming my skin. I held the sealed envelope tightly in my right hand. It was the ultimate shield. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that Bryce's entire conservatorship plan was built on a desperate criminal lie. If he walked into a county courthouse to file his fake dementia claim, he would be instantly arrested for perjury and filing false legal documents. I reached my car and unlocked the door. I pulled out my cell phone to call Frederick. I was ready to launch the aggressive counteroffensive. I was ready to move from defense to offense and finally trap Bryce in his own web of arrogance and lies. I stood in the sunlit parking lot of the medical center, holding the sealed envelope containing my absolute freedom. The heavy weight that had rested on my chest since yesterday afternoon was entirely gone. I had the legal ammunition to destroy Bryce's malicious plan before he could even file his fake paperwork at the courthouse. I reached into my coat pocket to retrieve my car keys. My fingers brushed against my cell phone. The screen lit up with a sudden sharp vibration. It was a priority notification email from my personal banking application. I frowned. I had completely closed my primary accounts the day before. There should have been no active alerts on my phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the message. The email was not from my usual local bank. It was an automated security alert from the massive national financial institution that held the fraudulent $300,000 home equity line of credit. Because my name was forged as the primary guarantor on the account, the bank's automated system had pulled my contact information from my credit file and sent me a standard courtesy notification regarding a massive outbound transaction. I stared at the screen and felt the blood freeze in my veins. The notification was a digital wire transfer receipt. 10 minutes ago, Bryce had logged into the fraudulent account and initiated a transfer for the maximum allowable limit. He was attempting to move the entire $300,000 in one single sweeping motion. I looked at the destination details printed on the digital receipt. He was not moving the money to a local checking account to buy his luxury car. The routing number was attached to a private offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. Bryce was not just stealing my equity. He was laundering it out of the country entirely. My engineering mind immediately calculated the catastrophic implications of this move. If that wire transfer successfully cleared the United States banking system, the money would be completely untraceable and entirely unrecoverable. Before I reveal what I did next, comment the number 300,000 below if you're still here and paying attention. I want to know who's really walking through this storm with me. And just a quick note. The next part of this story includes certain dramatized elements created for reflection and storytelling depth. If that's not your preference, this is your moment to step away. It would vanish into the dark vacuum of international banking secrecy. Once the funds cleared the domestic system, they would dissolve into offshore channels designed for silence. The originating bank would then pivot, holding me responsible for the full $300,000, because my forged signature sat neatly on the collateral document. If I failed to produce the stolen funds, they would initiate foreclosure proceedings. The property would be seized, auctioned, liquidated to recover their loss. Bryce would disappear with the money. I would be left financially ruined. And Brianna, whether she understood the full scale of his scheme or not, would be standing in front of a house scheduled for public sale. It was a scorched earth exit strategy. He had likely calculated that his conservatorship maneuver might encounter resistance, so he prepared a contingency drain the credit line, wire it offshore, and vanish before the legal machinery could react. I did not panic. Panic is inefficient. It fractures judgment. It compromises structural integrity. Instead, I reached for my phone and dialed Frederick's direct number. He answered immediately. I read the wire alert word for word: transaction identification number, amount, timestamp, offshore routing code. My voice remained steady, precise. Frederick inhaled sharply. The composed confidence he carried the day before evaporated. International transfers of that size trigger a mandatory federal security hold, he said. But the hold is limited. 2 hours. After that, the funds release into the global network. He paused. You have 1 hour and 50 minutes. If the transfer cleared, recovery would be nearly impossible. Frederick gave me an unequivocal instruction. Do not call customer service. A phone representative won't have the authority to halt an offshore wire. They'll waste time verifying your identity while the clock runs out. He told me to drive immediately to the bank's regional corporate headquarters in the financial district. He was drafting an emergency federal fraud injunction and would meet me there within 30 minutes. If we don't reach the regional wire manager before the hold expires, he said, your equity is gone. I ended the call and moved. My engine roared as I exited the medical center parking lot. I merged onto the interstate, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Morning traffic was already thick rows of brake lights stretching endlessly ahead like a red tide. I glanced at the digital clock on my dashboard. Every minute was measurable loss. Every delay strengthened Bryce's position. The arrogance of the man sharpened my focus. He believed he could forge my name, siphon my equity, and wire it to a tropical island without consequence. He believed age equated to hesitation. He miscalculated. I pressed down on the accelerator, guiding my vintage car through narrow gaps in traffic with deliberate precision. Years of engineering taught me to calculate space angles timing. The interstate became alive, schematic lanes, shifting openings, forming and collapsing. I was not surrendering 15 years of equity to a reckless thief. 40 minutes later, I reached the glass tower that housed the bank's regional headquarters. The security hold had exactly 1 hour remaining. I pulled into the front loading zone and left the car illegally parked. A citation was irrelevant. Inside the lobby was cavernous marble floors, polished to a mirror sheen, ceilings soaring above. The air carried the sterile scent of wealth. Frederick was already there, standing near the security desk. He held a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents, ink still sharp pages clipped together with metallic precision. His expression was hard. No greeting. He handed me a copy of the emergency injunction and gestured toward the executive elevators. We had no appointment, no security clearance, only certified medical documentation, proving my competency and evidence of federal fraud. We walked past the protesting security guards. Frederick moved with authority. I followed without hesitation. When one guard stepped forward to block us, Frederick held up the injunction. Emergency federal matter, he said flatly. The guard hesitated. That was enough. We entered the elevator and pressed the button for the executive floor. The doors slid shut. The ascent felt both instantaneous and endless. Bryce was somewhere, perhaps seated comfortably, watching his screen, waiting for confirmation. He believed he had already won. He believed the old man he threatened was paralyzed by fear. He had no idea that I was riding an elevator toward the nerve center of the bank's wire division with legal authority in my hand. The doors opened. The 42nd floor did not resemble a retail branch. There were no teller windows, no plastic chairs. The carpeting was thick and dark, absorbing sound. The walls were paneled in polished mahogany. Abstract art hung in careful symmetry. Power did not announce itself loudly here. It operated quietly. We stepped forward. Immediately, a woman in a tailored gray suit intercepted us. She held a digital tablet and wore the polished expression of someone accustomed to filtering out inconvenience. "This floor is by appointment only," she said coolly. "Security will escort you back to the lobby." Frederick did not slow down. He placed the injunction directly in front of her tablet. "This is an emergency federal fraud injunction concerning a wire transfer currently under security hold. We require immediate access to your regional wire operations manager." Her expression shifted slightly. "This is highly irregular," she replied. $300,000, Frederick said evenly. "Fraudulently obtained. Currently pending offshore release. If this clears your institution, becomes a participant in federal litigation." Silence. The air in the corridor tightened. The woman studied the documents. Her composure faltered just enough to reveal calculation behind the professional mask. "How long on the hold?" she asked. 48 minutes, Frederick replied. She exhaled once. "Follow me." We moved quickly through a series of secured corridors. Each door required card access. Each step echoed softly against the thick carpet. At the end of the hallway, she opened a glass office overlooking the city skyline. Inside stood a man in a navy suit, reviewing data on multiple monitors. He turned as we entered, irritation already forming. "This is the regional wire manager," the woman said. Frederick placed the injunction on the desk. The manager's irritation dissolved into alert focus as he scanned the document. He logged into his system and entered the transaction ID I had memorized. The room fell silent except for the faint clicking of keys. "There's a hold in place," he said finally. 51 minutes remaining. "Freeze it," Frederick said. The manager hesitated. "We require confirmation of fraud." Frederick handed over the forged loan documentation, the certified medical affidavit proving my competency, the preliminary forensic signature analysis. "This wire originates from a fraudulent home equity line of credit obtained through identity theft," Frederick stated. "If released, your institution becomes complicit in laundering stolen funds." The manager's fingers moved across the keyboard. Time compressed. Seconds felt enormous. Finally, he leaned back. "The transfer is flagged. Suspended pending investigation." The words landed with force. It was not yet victory, but it was interruption. Bryce would not receive confirmation of success. Not today. I stood in that office watching the skyline stretch beyond the glass. For the first time since the alert appeared on my phone, the weight in my chest eased. He believed he was erasing me. Instead, he had triggered a federal fraud freeze within the very institution he trusted to conceal his theft. And the collapse of his carefully constructed scheme had just begun. Frederick did not even break his stride. He walked straight past her, holding the thick stack of legal documents like a loaded weapon. He demanded to be directed to the regional director of wire operations immediately. The woman attempted to block his path, but Frederick simply stated his name and the name of his law firm. He informed her that if she delayed us for even a single minute, she would be personally named as a co-conspirator in a federal bank fraud lawsuit involving the theft of $300,000. The woman froze and silently pointed toward a large set of frosted glass doors at the end of the long hallway. We pushed through the glass doors without knocking. The regional director was a middle-aged man sitting behind a massive glass desk. He was on a phone call, but hung up immediately when we barged into his private sanctuary. He stood up, his face flushing with anger, demanding to know who we were and how we had bypassed building security. Frederick walked directly to the glass desk and slammed the emergency federal fraud injunction down onto the smooth surface. The heavy sound echoed loudly in the quiet executive office. Frederick leaned over the desk, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. He told the director to sit down and look at the screen on his computer. He recited the exact account number and the transaction identification code for the Cayman Islands wire transfer. The director hesitated, but the sheer aggressive authority radiating from my attorney forced him back into his leather chair. He typed the numbers into his keyboard. His eyes widened as the massive outbound transfer populated on his screen. The director tried to deploy standard banking protocol. He nervously adjusted his tie and stated that the transfer had already been authorized by the primary account holder. He claimed the bank could not simply halt a massive international wire without a verified court order or a direct request from the client who initiated the transaction. Frederick smiled his cold, devastating smile. He dropped the second piece of paper onto the desk. It was a high-resolution photograph of the forged signature on the original home equity loan document, placed directly next to a certified copy of my actual legal signature. Frederick told the director that the man who authorized the wire was not the legal property owner. He informed the director that the bank had negligently approved a $300,000 credit line based on an incredibly sloppy forgery. Frederick then dropped the final piece of paper. It was the certified medical affidavit from the State Supreme Court Medical Board, proving my absolute mental competency. Frederick did not wait for the director to process the information. He looked at the clock on the wall. We had exactly 14 minutes remaining before the federal security hold expired, and the money vanished offshore. Frederick told the director that we were completely bypassing the local banking chain of command. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed a direct number. He placed the phone on the glass desk and activated the speaker function. A stern voice answered immediately, identifying himself as a senior agent with the Federal Wire Fraud Division. Frederick had already contacted him during our drive to the bank. Frederick formally introduced me and then instructed the bank director to identify himself to the federal agent. The director was sweating profusely now. He stated his name and his corporate title. The federal agent informed the director that he was looking at the real-time routing data for the Cayman Islands transfer. The agent ordered the director to manually override the local system and execute a hard freeze on the entire account hierarchy immediately. The director tried to argue that a hard freeze would lock the entire credit line and flag the account for a mandatory federal investigation. He warned that the bank would suffer a massive loss if the collateral was tied up in a federal court battle. I finally spoke up. I leaned over the desk, looking the panicked executive dead in the eyes. I told him he was no longer worried about a financial loss. I told him he was currently harboring stolen funds. I explained that if he let that money leave the United States, I would not just sue the bank for the lost equity. I would use my remaining wealth to ensure the federal government investigated every single loan his department had approved over the last 5 years. I told him I was a structural engineer and I knew exactly how to find the weak points in a massive corporate foundation. I promised him I would tear his entire career down to the studs. The director swallowed hard. He looked at the phone. He looked at the forged signature. He looked at the clock. We had exactly 7 minutes left. He turned back to his computer keyboard. His hands were shaking slightly as he typed a long sequence of administrative override codes into the banking software. He navigated through multiple security prompts, clicking past the standard warnings. He reached the final execution screen. He pressed the enter key with a heavy sigh of defeat. The glowing monitor on his desk instantly refreshed. The status of the $300,000 wire transfer changed from pending security clearance to a bright red flashing notification that read, "Transaction federally rejected." The funds had bounced. The money was violently yanked back from the international routing network and slammed directly back into the frozen domestic account. The absolute finality of that red flashing text was the most beautiful thing I had seen in years. The money was completely locked. The entire fraudulent home equity line of credit was permanently frozen. Bryce could not withdraw another single dime. He could not move the money offshore. He could not even access the account to see why the transfer had failed. The federal government now had a complete stranglehold on the stolen funds. Bryce was officially trapped in a financial cage of his own making. Frederick thanked the federal agent and ended the call. He picked up his legal documents and placed them back into his leather briefcase. He looked at the sweating bank director and advised him to retain independent legal counsel because the federal investigators would be arriving at his branch very soon to review his negligent underwriting practices. We walked out of the executive office and took the elevator back down to the lobby. The entire operation had taken less than 20 minutes. I walked out of the glass building and stepped back into the bright afternoon sunlight. The city noise washed over me, but my mind was incredibly quiet and focused. I had secured the perimeter. The catastrophic structural failure had been stopped before the load-bearing columns gave way. The wire transfer was frozen. The credit line was flagged. The immediate collapse had been prevented. But engineering teaches one immutable truth. When you apply massive counterpressure to a failing structure, you must anticipate how the opposing force will react. Bryce was at home right now. He was likely seated in his polished office chair, refreshing his offshore account, waiting for $300,000 of stolen equity to appear. At any moment, a red notification would flash across his screen. Transfer rejected. Account under federal review, credit line suspended. His carefully constructed criminal architecture had just imploded. And I knew precisely what a man like Bryce does when cornered. He does not surrender. He lashes out. He panics. He calculates his sinking position and searches for anything within reach that can be converted into oxygen. Desperation is predictable. It erodes logic and replaces it with raw survival instinct. I turned to Frederick and told him our defensive actions were complete. The injunction was filed, the transfer halted, federal scrutiny engaged. Now we needed to prepare for retaliation. Bryce's lifestyle depended on liquidity. His credit cards were likely maxed. His car reservation had already collapsed in public humiliation. The offshore escape he counted on had been sealed shut. He would be scrambling for immediate cash. And when a man like that realizes the pension is gone, the fraudulent loan is frozen, and the exit route destroyed, he will search for the last remaining asset he believes he can seize. I left the bank, knowing the true war had just begun. I did not drive home immediately. I understood the sequence unfolding inside the main house on my property. Bryce would be refreshing his screen obsessively. When the federal hold appeared, panic would flood his system. He would call private wealth services. He would be told calmly and without sympathy that the account was locked under active investigation. The illusion of control would shatter. Panic is chemical, predictable. It strips away reason and leaves only hunger. I parked at a small diner on the edge of town and ordered black coffee. The booth was cracked vinyl. The air smelled faintly of grease and burnt toast. I sat there deliberately, allowing time to do its work. You do not chase a trapped animal immediately. You let it thrash. Bryce was drowning in hidden debt. The interest payments on a $300,000 credit line do not wait politely. Creditors demand. Banks escalate. Appearances must be maintained. He needed cash fast, to sustain the illusion, to silence collectors, to reassure himself that control still existed. For 3 full hours I remained seated watching the afternoon light shift across the diner window. I imagined the internal unraveling occurring in that polished office at home. The frantic calls, the sweating silence, the realization that the safety net had dissolved. By the time the sun dipped toward the tree line, I paid my bill and drove back. I did not pull into the driveway. Instead, I parked along the street and approached on foot. The air was crisp. Evening wind cut against my face as I walked. Before I reached the guest house, I saw it. The side door, splintered, hanging from a single broken hinge. He had not searched for a spare key. He had not attempted subtlety. He had used force. I stepped over fractured wood and entered my home. The interior was devastation. The small kitchen table where I drank coffee each morning was overturned. Chairs lay scattered. Drawers had been ripped from their tracks and dumped violently onto the hardwood floor. My engineering textbooks, decades of knowledge, were torn and thrown across the carpet. It was not theft conducted by a careful mind. It was a frenzy. Bryce had torn through the house like a starving predator searching for anything convertible to immediate cash. Jewelry, hidden envelopes, bonds, emergency reserves. He never understood how I operate. I do not hoard cash in floor safes or under mattresses. But when I stepped into my bedroom, a different cold entered my bloodstream. The closet door stood wide open. The loose floorboard I had secured years ago had been ripped aside. The heavy steel lockbox beneath it was mangled, its metal warped edges bent outward by a crowbar's brute leverage. I lowered myself slowly to my knees. The box was empty. He had not found money. He had found something far more valuable. The original leather key fob and the vintage paper title to my 1968 Ford Mustang. The detached rear garage. The car. That Mustang was not an asset. It was memory forged in steel. Over 40 years ago, when I received my first major engineering promotion, my wife and I found that car rusting in a salvage yard. The body was scarred, the engine block seized, the leather cracked beyond recognition. We bought it anyway. Every weekend after that, we stood side by side in the garage. I rebuilt the engine piece by piece while she sanded the body down to bare metal. We replaced wiring harnesses, reupholstered seats, polished chrome until it gleamed. It was not restoration. It was partnership. The finished car was pristine, a deep, glossy finish that reflected sunlight like liquid glass. But more than that, it carried fingerprints of our shared labor, laughter in the garage, music playing through an old radio while we worked. That Mustang was the physical embodiment of our marriage. And now Bryce had it. Not because he understood its value, but because he believed it could be sold. I rose slowly from the floor and walked toward the rear garage. The door was open. The space inside was empty. The echo of absence filled the room. He had taken it. He had taken the last tangible connection to my wife because he believed everything in my life was currency. He did not understand that some things are not measured in dollars, but he had made a mistake. A vintage 1968 Mustang is not a disposable asset. It is identifiable, traceable, registered. He had not stolen a stack of unmarked bills. He had stolen something with a paper trail, and desperation leaves fingerprints. Standing in that empty garage, I felt no panic, only precision. He had escalated the conflict from fraud to grand theft. And in doing so, he had stepped directly into a category of crime that even his arrogance could not smooth over. The war had shifted from defensive to offensive, and for the first time since the wire alert appeared on my phone, I understood something with complete clarity. Bryce believed he was stripping me of what I loved most. In reality, he had just handed me the final piece of evidence required to dismantle him completely. Her small hands had polished that wooden steering wheel. Her bright laughter was permanently woven into the fabric of those seats. It was the only tangible piece of her beautiful soul I had left in this entire world. I had kept it covered and meticulously protected, refusing to sell it even when Brianna begged me for the money years ago. Bryce knew exactly what that classic car meant to me. He knew it was my heart. But he also knew that a fully restored 1968 Mustang could fetch over $80,000 in pure, untraceable cash from a shady underground vehicle collector within a matter of hours. I stood up from the bedroom floor and walked out the back door toward the detached garage. The heavy metal roll-up door was wide open to the evening air. The large concrete bay was entirely empty. A single dark patch of oil stained the floor where the beautiful machine had rested safely for years. Bryce had actually done it. In his blind, frantic panic to cover his fraudulent tracks and secure escape funds, he had crossed the final boundary of human decency. He had stolen the one thing in the world I truly loved. Most men would have fallen to the concrete floor and wept over the profound violation. Most men would have called their daughter screaming and begging for the vehicle to be returned to its rightful place. I simply stood in the empty garage, breathing in the faint, lingering smell of old motor oil and exhaust. Bryce thought he had dealt me a devastating emotional blow. He thought he had taken my most prized possession to fund his criminal escape. He believed he was speeding away toward his financial salvation in a classic muscle car. He believed my old age made me an easy, vulnerable target for his cruelty. He did not realize that a man who spends his entire life building indestructible bridges never leaves his most valuable asset unprotected. He did not know that his desperate act of theft was not a victory. It was the absolute final nail in his own coffin. He had just handed me the exact tool I needed to ensure he would never sleep in a comfortable bed again. I walked calmly back into my ruined guest house, pulled my cell phone from my pocket, and prepared to unleash the absolute wrath of the law upon him. I stood in the center of the empty concrete bay, letting the reality of the empty space wash over me. The faint smell of old motor oil and premium exhaust hung in the damp evening air. A lesser man would have reached for his phone immediately to call his daughter. A weaker father would have dialed Brianna's number, begging her to intervene, pleading with her to make her husband bring the car back before any real damage was done. I did not touch my phone. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly turned around and walked out of the detached garage, pulling the heavy metal door back down until it locked into place. The loud metallic clang echoed across the quiet property. I walked back toward the ruined guest house, stepping carefully over the shattered pieces of my own front door. Bryce had ransacked my living space with the chaotic energy of a desperate animal. He had flipped my furniture, torn my books, and violated my privacy. But as I navigated the debris field he had left behind, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of clinical detachment. I walked into my bedroom and looked at the violently pried steel lockbox on the floor. Bryce believed he had discovered my ultimate vulnerability. He believed he had found the key to his salvation hidden beneath my floorboards. What Bryce failed to understand is that a structural engineer never leaves a critical load-bearing asset without a redundant safety mechanism. 3 days ago, before the explosive confrontation in my kitchen, before the massive banking freeze, and before the forged medical documents, I had noticed something incredibly subtle. I had watched Bryce standing in the driveway, smoking an expensive cigar, staring intensely at the detached garage. I saw the distinct look of pure, greedy calculation in his eyes. He was looking at the metal door the way a starving man looks at a locked pantry. I knew instantly that if his financial house of cards ever collapsed, he would try to liquidate my vintage car to save himself. I did not confront him that day. I did not change the locks on the garage or attempt to move the vehicle to a secure storage facility. A visible defense only forces an enemy to plan a more aggressive attack. Instead, I drove the vintage vehicle to a highly specialized automotive security firm downtown. I spent $4,000 in cash to have a military-grade global positioning satellite tracker permanently welded directly into the steel undercarriage of the vehicle. This was not a cheap plastic device you buy on the internet and magnetized to a bumper. This was a completely integrated tracking unit hardwired directly into the main electrical harness of the car. It was entirely invisible to the naked eye. Even a professional mechanic would need hours to locate it and dismantle it. I had the technicians link the encrypted signal directly to a private application on my secure tablet. I built a digital cage around my own property, and Bryce had just voluntarily locked himself inside of it. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat and pulled out my smartphone. I bypassed the standard contacts list. I did not call Brianna. I did not call Frederick Crow. I dialed the direct emergency dispatch line for the State Highway Patrol. The phone rang exactly twice before a female dispatcher answered the call. She asked me to state the nature of my emergency. I did not sound frantic. I did not sound like a frightened elderly man whose home had just been burglarized. I spoke with the precise, measured cadence of a man reading a technical manual. I informed the dispatcher that I needed to report an active grand theft auto in progress. I informed the dispatcher that the stolen vehicle was a fully restored 1968 classic muscle car. My voice was steady, deliberate. I provided the exact license plate number, the full vehicle identification number, and even the precise factory paint code registered with the state. There was no hesitation in my tone, no uncertainty. I had memorized every detail years ago. She began moving through her standard procedural script, her voice calm and professional. She asked when I had last seen the vehicle. She asked whether I suspected anyone in particular. I let her finish half of the second question before I interrupted her gently but firmly. I know exactly who took it, I said, and I know exactly where it is right now. I walked across the debris-strewn living room, stepping over splintered wood from my broken door. I lifted a fallen kitchen chair and set it upright beside the overturned table. Sitting down slowly, I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat and removed my secure digital tablet. I activated the encrypted tracking application with a fingerprint scan. The dark room illuminated instantly. A high-resolution digital map of the entire state expanded across the screen. Roads glowed faintly in blue lines. County borders shimmered in gray. And there, moving swiftly along a thin red artery of interstate highway, was a bright, pulsating red dot. I read the live coordinates directly to the dispatcher. Latitude, longitude, direction of travel. The vehicle is traveling southbound on Interstate 95, I told her, approaching the county line. Mile marker 247. Estimated speed 83 miles per hour. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her fingers stop typing. Sir, she said carefully, how are you tracking this vehicle in real time? I explained calmly. A military-grade GPS unit had been professionally integrated into the vehicle's chassis. It was not magnetic, not removable. It was welded directly into the undercarriage and hardwired into the electrical harness. The signal was encrypted and linked exclusively to my private device. I added one final detail. The driver is my son-in-law, I said. He is fleeing the jurisdiction with stolen property valued at over $80,000. The air seemed to sharpen around me. The dispatcher placed me on a brief hold while she relayed the coordinates to active highway patrol units. I remained seated in the dim room, watching the red dot advance steadily down the interstate. It moved with confidence, fast, aggressive, purposeful. Bryce was pushing the engine. I imagined him gripping the polished wooden steering wheel with sweating hands. I imagined the adrenaline in his bloodstream, the delusion of victory. He had broken into my home. He had taken what he believed was my final weakness. He probably assumed I was sitting in the ruins, overwhelmed and defeated. He underestimated the silence. Silence is not paralysis. Silence is preparation. The red dot continued south, nearing the state border. If he crossed that line, the legal consequences would escalate significantly. Interstate flight, federal jurisdiction, enhanced charges layered upon an already catastrophic indictment. He believed he was driving toward freedom. In reality, he was accelerating toward a federal penitentiary. The dispatcher returned to the line, her voice transformed, alert, energized. 3 interceptor units have acquired the tracking signal, she informed me. They are moving into position ahead of the vehicle. A felony stop will be executed within approximately 4 minutes. I acknowledged her calmly. She asked me to remain on the line to confirm the suspect's identity once detained. I agreed and placed the phone on speaker, resting it on my knee while I continued watching the screen. The red dot pulsed. It was strange how something so small, a digital beacon, no larger than a pixel, could carry the weight of an entire man's future. I imagined Bryce glancing in his rearview mirror, unaware of the converging patrol units. I imagined the flicker of blue and red lights erupting behind him. The moment confusion turned into fear. He had relied entirely on the stereotype of the frail, passive old man. He did not understand that engineers design redundancies. Suddenly, the red dot stopped. Not gradually, not slowly, it froze. Dead center on the interstate. Seconds later, the dispatcher's voice returned through the speaker. "The vehicle has been boxed in," she said. "The suspect has been removed at gunpoint and is currently being placed in custody." Her tone was precise, controlled, but I could hear the undercurrent of intensity beneath it. She asked me to confirm the suspect's description. I recited Bryce's exact height, approximate weight, hair color, eye color. I described the tailored designer suit he had been wearing earlier that afternoon, navy, slim-cut Italian fabric. There was a brief exchange in the background as she relayed the information to officers on scene. Then she returned. Identity confirmed. Suspect is in custody. Vehicle recovered without damage. Without damage. Those 3 words carried immense weight. The Mustang, my wife's laughter embedded in its leather seats, her fingerprints preserved in polished chrome, was intact. She informed me that a detective would contact me shortly to coordinate retrieval and to take a formal statement for prosecution. I thanked her for her efficiency. My voice remained even. When I ended the call, the room returned to silence. The only sound was the faint electrical hum of my tablet screen before it dimmed and went dark. I looked around at the destroyed living room, overturned furniture, scattered textbooks, splintered wood. The physical damage was cosmetic, superficial, replaceable. The structural trap, however, had performed flawlessly. Bryce was now seated in the back of a police cruiser, wrists bound behind him in steel restraints. The man who believed he was orchestrating my collapse was staring at the inside of a reinforced partition window. His life, built on arrogance, fraud, and manipulation, had just encountered a counterforce stronger than his deception. He thought he had taken my heart. Instead, he had triggered the final mechanism of his own undoing. I sat there for several long moments, breathing slowly. Not triumphant, not vindictive, simply resolved. An engineer understands that when pressure exceeds tolerance, structures fail. Bryce had applied pressure recklessly, believing the foundation beneath him was solid. He never realized he was standing on hollow beams. And now, as the sun dipped lower beyond the shattered doorway, I understood something with absolute clarity. The trap had not been sprung in anger. It had been executed in precision. And precision, when applied correctly, leaves no escape. But the chain of consequences was not yet complete. Bryce was only half of the equation. Brianna was still sitting comfortably in the massive house I had paid for, entirely unaware that her husband had just been arrested for grand theft auto, and that the federal government had frozen all of their fraudulent assets. It was time to deliver the final devastating blow. It was time to walk across the lawn, knock on the front door of the main house, and hand my daughter the itemized receipt for her absolute ruin. I sat in the darkness of my destroyed living room, waiting for the inevitable aftermath. The digital tablet on my lap had gone completely dark, but the reality of the trap I had set was just beginning to unfold. My cell phone vibrated heavily against my leg, breaking the absolute silence of the room. It was a direct call from the lead detective of the State Highway Patrol. He spoke with the gruff, heavy satisfaction of a man who had just taken a desperate criminal off the streets. He wanted to personally update me on the exact details of the felony traffic stop before the local news stations picked up the scanner chatter. The detective told me that when the interceptor units activated their emergency lights and sirens, Bryce did not immediately pull his vehicle over to the shoulder. In his absolute blind panic, he attempted to accelerate the vintage muscle car, pushing the classic engine toward its physical limit. He tried to weave through heavy interstate traffic, attempting to reach an upcoming exit. The detective explained that Bryce was heading directly for an industrial district, known for housing illegal vehicle dismantling operations, commonly referred to as chop shops. He intended to trade my priceless vehicle for pennies on the dollar to secure immediate, untraceable escape funds. But Bryce was an arrogant corporate coward, not a professional getaway driver. He did not possess the skill to control a heavy rear-wheel drive machine at those extreme speeds. The highway patrol executed a highly coordinated tactical maneuver. They boxed him in against the concrete median barrier and forced the vehicle to a complete halt without inflicting a single scratch on the pristine bodywork. The detective told me Bryce locked the doors and stubbornly refused to exit the vehicle. He rolled up the windows and ignored the direct lawful orders of the armed officers. The police had to shatter the driver's side window with a steel baton. They drew their service weapons, reached inside the cabin, and physically dragged Bryce out onto the rough asphalt. Bryce had screamed and thrashed violently, threatening to sue the entire police department. He screamed that he was a wealthy, respected financial executive and that they were making a massive mistake. The officers responded by planting a heavy knee firmly into his spine and securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. The detective assured me that Bryce was currently sitting in a cold, concrete holding cell at the county jail. He was facing multiple severe felony charges, including grand theft, auto fleeing, and eluding law enforcement, and violently resisting arrest. The classic car was being carefully loaded onto a flatbed transport truck and taken to a highly secure indoor impound facility where I could retrieve it tomorrow morning. I thanked the detective for his precise professional work and ended the call. The silence returned to my ruined guest house, but it lasted for less than 10 minutes. I heard the frantic, chaotic sound of high heels clicking rapidly against the concrete walkway outside. The broken front door was suddenly pushed all the way open, hitting the interior wall with a loud thud. Brianna stood in the doorway. She was an absolute vision of total collapse. The entitled, arrogant woman who had stood in my kitchen just yesterday demanding my pension money was completely gone. Her expensive designer jacket was improperly buttoned and hanging off her shoulder. Her carefully styled hair was a messy, tangled disaster. Thick black makeup ran down her cheeks in dark, ugly streams. She was frantically clutching her cell phone to her chest, as if her life depended on it. She took one trembling step into the ruined living room and saw the overturned furniture, the shattered wood, and the scattered debris. She did not even register the fact that her husband was the one who had violently destroyed my home. She threw herself onto her knees right in the center of the torn paper and broken glass. She began to sob uncontrollably, the sound echoing loudly off the bare walls. It was not a quiet, dignified, emotional release. It was the loud, ugly wailing of a woman who had just watched her entire privileged existence evaporate into thin air. She looked up at me with wild, desperate eyes and told me Bryce had just called her from the county jail using his single allotted phone call. She choked on her own tears as she explained that the local magistrate had denied him immediate bail because he was considered a severe flight risk after attempting to outrun the highway patrol units. Brianna crawled across the messy floor toward my wooden chair, reaching out with shaking hands to grab the fabric of my pant leg. She begged me to pick up my phone and call the police station right now. She pleaded with me to tell the lead detective that it was all a terrible family misunderstanding. She wanted me to lie to the state authorities. She wanted me to officially declare that I had freely given Bryce the keys to the vintage vehicle and that he had my full legal permission to drive it across the state line. She promised me that if I called the police and dropped the grand theft auto charges, they would never bother me about my monthly pension money ever again. She swore they would completely abandon the fake conservatorship petition tomorrow morning. She looked frantically around the destroyed room and promised to buy me all new expensive furniture and hire a professional construction crew to repair my front door. She tried to invoke the sacred memory of her late mother, begging me to show mercy for the sake of our family legacy. She cried that Bryce would immediately lose his high-paying corporate job if he caught a felony conviction, and that his professional reputation in the financial sector would be permanently ruined. She told me she simply could not survive the social humiliation of being married to a convicted felon in front of all her wealthy friends. Every single word falling out of her mouth was entirely focused on her own comfort, her own social standing, and her own financial security. She did not offer a single genuine apology for the forged medical documents, the stolen pension money, or the profound disrespect they had shown me for the last 3 years. I looked down at my daughter crying on the floor. I did not reach out to touch her shoulder. I did not offer her a tissue to wipe her ruined face. I sat perfectly still in my chair and let her tears fall onto my leather shoes. I told her to let go of my clothes immediately. My voice was completely flat and utterly devoid of any paternal warmth. Brianna flinched violently at the absolute coldness in my tone and slowly pulled her hands back, holding them against her chest. I pointed a single finger toward the twisted steel lockbox resting on the floor of my bedroom, visible through the open doorway. I told her that her husband had violently broken into my private sanctuary and stolen the only physical memory I had left of the woman who gave birth to her. I told her that Bryce had not simply borrowed a car for a joyride. He had deliberately stolen an $80,000 liquid asset to fund his escape from federal justice. I watched a sudden wave of deep confusion wash over her tear-stained face. She stopped crying for a fraction of a second. She asked me what I meant by federal justice. I realized in that exact moment that Bryce had not told her the entire truth during his frantic phone call from the holding cell. He had been too ashamed, or perhaps too terrified to confess his ultimate failure. He had not told her about the frozen bank accounts or the failed offshore wire transfer. I leaned forward in my chair and looked directly into Brianna's terrified eyes. I told her I was not going to make a single phone call to save him. I told her the grand theft auto charge was completely legitimate, and I would be proudly testifying against him in open court. But I did not stop there. I reached onto the small side table next to me and picked up the heavy black binder. I pulled out the certified forensic audit of the forged home equity loan. I dropped the heavy stack of legal documents directly onto the floor in front of her. I informed her that her husband was not just a car thief. I told her he had secretly forged my signature to take out a $300,000 fraudulent loan against the very house she was currently living in. I watched her eyes widen in absolute horror as she stared at the highlighted bank statements. I told her that federal investigators were currently auditing every single transaction Bryce had ever made, and that all of their shared bank accounts were permanently frozen by the United States government. I told her that Bryce was not coming home tomorrow or the next day. He was going to federal prison for a very long time. I ordered her to get off my floor and go back to her massive house to pack her designer bags, because very soon she was not going to have a roof over her head. Brianna stared at the heavy stack of legal documents resting on the torn carpet of my ruined living room. The thick black binder I had dropped at her feet seemed to radiate a terrifying gravity. She slowly reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the top page. It was the certified forensic audit of the $300,000 home equity line of credit. I watched her perfectly manicured nails scrape against the paper as her eyes darted back and forth across the dense financial text. She did not understand the complex banking terminology, but she absolutely recognized the address printed at the top of the loan agreement. It was the address of the massive property she had lived in for the past 15 years. It was the address of her supposed forever home. I broke the silence with a voice so calm, it sounded like a judge reading a final verdict. I told her that while she was busy planning to lock me away in a state-run psychiatric ward, her husband was busy mortgaging the very ground she walked on. She shook her head violently side to side, attempting to physically reject the reality printed in black ink. She stammered that there must be a mistake, and that Bryce would never take out a loan without telling her. I told her to turn to the third page of the document and look at the bottom right corner. She flipped the heavy paper over and stared at the signature line. I asked her if that looked like my handwriting. I reminded her that I had spent my entire adult life drafting precise structural engineering blueprints, and that my personal signature was a rigidly uniform block of text. The signature on that banking document was a sloppy, chaotic imitation. I told her that Bryce had deliberately forged my name to bypass the deed restrictions. He had committed aggravated identity theft to steal $300,000 of my hard-earned equity, and he had used her house as the direct collateral. The color completely drained from Brianna's face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. She dropped the papers back onto the floor as if they were physically burning her hands. I did not give her a single moment to catch her breath. I continued laying out the exact dimensions of the trap her husband had built for them. I informed her that the federal government does not take kindly to massive domestic bank fraud. I explained that my attorney, Frederick Crow, had already contacted the Federal Wire Fraud Division this afternoon. I told her that federal agents had successfully intercepted an international wire transfer Bryce attempted to send to the Cayman Islands just a few hours ago. He was trying to launder the stolen equity out of the country and leave her entirely alone to face the catastrophic financial fallout. I told her that right now, federal investigators were actively auditing every single bank account attached to Bryce's Social Security number, the joint checking accounts, the luxury credit cards, the mutual funds she thought secured her wealthy lifestyle, were all permanently frozen under federal authority. I watched the exact moment her mind comprehended the absolute totality of her ruin. The arrogant facade she had worn for years shattered completely, revealing the absolute selfish cowardice underneath. She did not express horror at what Bryce had done to me. She did not apologize for my stolen pension or my forged signature. Her survival instinct kicked in, and it was entirely focused on preserving herself at any cost. She fell back onto her knees and grabbed my hands. Her grip was painfully tight. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes and immediately began to rewrite history. She started throwing the man she had been married to for a decade directly under the bus. She cried out that she had absolutely no idea about the forged loan or the offshore bank accounts. She swore on her life that Bryce handled all of their finances and that he kept her completely in the dark. She claimed he was a manipulative monster who controlled every aspect of her existence. She pointed toward the splintered front door and the overturned furniture in my living room, using his violent burglary as proof of his unhinged criminal nature. She sobbed heavily, claiming she was just as much of a victim as I was. She begged me to call my expensive attorney and have him represent her in the divorce proceedings. She wanted me to use my wealth to shield her from the federal investigators. She promised she would testify against Bryce in federal court and tell the judge whatever I wanted her to say, as long as I protected her from going to prison and allowed her to stay in the main house. She continued her frantic, pathetic monologue, trying to weaponize my memories of her childhood. She reminded me of the days we used to spend together when she was a little girl before she met Bryce. She claimed Bryce had slowly poisoned her mind against me over the years, convincing her that I was a burden. She wept loudly, insisting that deep down she had always loved me, and that she had only gone along with the conservatorship plan because Bryce threatened to leave her if she refused. She painted a picture of herself as a helpless, terrified hostage, trapped in a marriage with a financial predator. She thought she could manipulate the innate protective instinct a father has for his daughter. She thought my love for her would override my logic and blind me to her obvious complicity. I looked down at the woman who shared my DNA and felt a profound, sickening disappointment. I pulled my hands out of her desperate grip and stood up from my wooden chair. I walked over to the destroyed kitchen area and picked up one of the dented cans of generic chicken soup Bryce had knocked onto the floor. I walked back and held the cheap aluminum can directly in front of her face. I asked her if Bryce had also forced her to feed me garbage while my pension deposited $5,500 into her account every single month. I asked her if Bryce had somehow brainwashed her into standing in my kitchen yesterday afternoon, eagerly nodding along while he threatened to lock me in a heavily medicated nursing facility. I reminded her that she had looked me dead in the eye and told me my mind was failing. She had weaponized my age against me for her own financial gain. She had willingly participated in the psychological torture required to set up the fake conservatorship. Brianna opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stared at the soup can, her lips trembling. I told her that true victims do not wear expensive diamond tennis bracelets purchased with stolen health insurance funds. I told her that true victims do not smirk when their elderly father is threatened with forced institutionalization. I explained that I had spent 40 years building strong foundations for bridges and buildings, but I had clearly failed to build a strong moral foundation for my own child. I told her she was not a victim of Bryce's greed. She was an active, enthusiastic partner in it. She had loved the lavish lifestyle, the luxury cars, and the expensive vacations far more than she had ever loved me. She was perfectly willing to let Bryce destroy my life, as long as she got to keep living in a massive house without ever having to work for it. She began to weep again loudly and pathetically, wrapping her arms around her own stomach. She begged me to forgive her. She pleaded for a second chance, crying that she was still my little girl and that family was supposed to stick together through difficult times. The sheer hypocrisy of her words hung heavily in the cold evening air. I told her that family is defined by mutual respect and basic human decency, not by shared blood. I told her I would not be calling Frederick Crow to help her with a divorce. I would not be using a single dime of my protected wealth to hire her a defense attorney. I told her that when the federal agents arrived to question her about the stolen $300,000, she would have to face them entirely on her own. I advised her to tell them the absolute truth, because lying to a federal investigator carries a 5-year mandatory prison sentence. She slowly stood up from the floor, wiping the smeared makeup from her eyes. She looked around my ruined guest house one last time, her shoulders completely slumped in total defeat. She whispered that she had nowhere else to go. She said her credit cards were already declining, and she had absolutely zero cash to her name. She said she would just go back to the main house, lock the doors, and figure out how to survive without Bryce. She thought the main house was still her ultimate sanctuary. She thought she still had a roof over her head, even if it was burdened by a massive fraudulent bank lien. She turned around and began to walk slowly toward the broken front door, dragging her feet like a condemned prisoner. She had absolutely no idea that the ground she was walking on no longer belonged to her. She had no idea that I was about to drop the final devastating piece of the structural collapse directly onto her head. Brianna reached the broken doorframe and placed her hand on the splintered wood. She let out a long, trembling breath, believing the absolute worst of her nightmare was finally over. She truly believed that she could simply walk across the manicured lawn, unlock the heavy oak front door of the main house, and collapse into her expensive king-sized bed. She believed that even though her husband was sitting in a concrete jail cell and her bank accounts were frozen by the federal government, she still possessed a fortress. She thought she still had the physical walls, the granite countertops, the heated swimming pool, and the social status that came with living in a massive suburban estate. She had spent her entire adult life wrapping her identity in the expensive architecture of that house. She was entirely oblivious to the fundamental engineering reality that a house is nothing more than a temporary arrangement of wood and glass resting on top of the only thing that actually holds permanent value. I did not raise my voice as I watched her prepare to leave my ruined guest house. I simply spoke her name into the cold evening air. She stopped and turned her head slightly, looking back at me over her trembling shoulder. I told her she was forgetting a critical detail about the physical property she was currently trying to retreat toward. I reminded her that 15 years ago, when I walked into the real estate office and wrote a massive cashier's check to purchase that estate, I did not buy it because I was impressed by the interior decorating. I am a structural engineer. I do not look at cosmetic finishes or expensive lighting fixtures. I look at the dirt. I look at the foundation. I look at the municipal infrastructure surrounding the perimeter. I told her that when I bought that house, I deliberately targeted a 2-acre parcel sitting directly adjacent to a rapidly expanding municipal transit corridor. Brianna turned fully around, facing me again, with a look of profound confusion settling over her tear-stained features. She did not understand why I was talking about municipal transit or dirt. I explained it to her in the simplest terms possible. I told her that she and Bryce had spent the last 15 years living inside a house that was sitting on land legally zoned for heavy commercial use. They had never bothered to look at the county zoning maps or the long-term city development plans. They were too busy throwing expensive dinner parties and buying luxury vehicles to realize they were sleeping in the exact center of a highly coveted commercial retail district. I watched her eyes blink rapidly as her exhausted mind struggled to process the information. I told her that for the past 5 years, I had been receiving weekly phone calls and aggressive certified letters from massive national corporate real estate developers. They desperately wanted to purchase the 2-acre parcel. They wanted to tear down her beautiful house and pave over her heated swimming pool to build a massive commercial retail complex. I explained that for 5 years, I had firmly rejected every single multi-million-dollar corporate buyout offer. I had left millions of dollars sitting on the table simply because I wanted my daughter to have a comfortable, beautiful place to live. I had protected her sanctuary from the corporate bulldozers out of pure, blind, paternal love. I paused and let the absolute silence of the room stretch out between us for several long seconds. I wanted her to fully grasp the magnitude of the sacrifice I had made for her before I revealed exactly how I had finally chosen to revoke it. I told her that yesterday morning after I left the bank, where I permanently closed my pension account, and before Bryce kicked open my front door, I made a second stop. I did not drive home to argue. I drove directly to the downtown corporate offices of the largest commercial retail developer in the state. I walked into their executive boardroom and informed their lead acquisitions director that I was finally ready to accept their standing offer. Brianna's jaw dropped open. Her breath caught in her throat, producing a sickening, choking sound. She took a single unsteady step back toward the broken doorframe, her hands reaching out blindly to grab the wall for physical support. I told her I sat at a massive glass conference table and signed the master deed transfer. I sold the entire 2-acre parcel of dirt right out from under her feet for a massive sum of commercial cash. I told her the transaction was completely legal, entirely finalized, and completely irreversible. The ground she was currently standing on no longer belonged to me, and it certainly no longer belonged to her. It belonged to a ruthless multi-billion-dollar corporate retail conglomerate. She began to shake her head violently, side to side, muttering the word "no" over and over again in a frantic, breathless whisper. She tried to find a logical flaw in my statement. She tried to use the fraudulent loan to her advantage. She stammered that I could not possibly sell the house because Bryce had just placed a $300,000 bank lien against the title. She thought the very crime her husband committed would somehow accidentally protect her from being evicted. She thought the bank would block the corporate sale. I looked at her and smiled, a cold, devastating smile. I explained that a retail conglomerate building a $50 million commercial center employs an army of the most ruthless corporate attorneys in the country. I told her that when their legal team discovered the active bank lien during their expedited morning title search, they did not cancel the real estate purchase. They simply contacted the federal authorities and the bank directly. They used my certified medical affidavit and the obvious forensic proof of Bryce's forgery to legally nullify the bank's claim to the physical property. The corporate lawyers completely crushed the local bank, forcing them to remove the lien from the physical dirt. The bank is now forced to collect their stolen $300,000 directly from Bryce's frozen offshore accounts and his personal future earnings. The land itself was immediately transferred to the developer entirely free and clear of any financial encumbrance. Brianna stared at me, her entire body trembling violently. The final illusion of her perfect, wealthy life was rapidly dissolving into absolute nothingness right in front of her eyes. She was finally realizing that she had absolutely nothing left to fall back on. Her husband was a federal criminal sitting in a concrete cell. Her shared bank accounts were seized by the United States government. Her credit was entirely destroyed. And now the massive, beautiful house she thought she owned was nothing more than a temporary structure waiting to be violently erased from the map. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat one final time. I pulled out a single crisp piece of white paper. It was not a bank statement or a forensic audit. It was a formal, legally binding corporate document. I walked slowly across the debris-covered floor and held the paper out to her. She did not raise her hands to take it. She just stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. I read the heavy black text, printed at the top of the page, out loud. It was a mandatory 30-day notice to vacate the premises. I told her the retail developer was not interested in becoming a residential landlord. They were not going to let her rent the house or negotiate a temporary lease. They wanted the dirt, and they wanted it immediately. I informed her that she had exactly 30 days to pack her designer clothes, her expensive shoes, and whatever worthless items she could carry. I told her that on the morning of the 31st day, a fleet of heavy industrial bulldozers and demolition excavators would arrive at the end of the driveway. They were going to smash through the heavy oak front door, crush the granite countertops, and grind the heated swimming pool into dust. They were going to completely level the entire property and pave a commercial parking lot directly over the exact spot where her bedroom currently sat. The sound that erupted from Brianna's throat was not a standard human cry. It was a raw, visceral, tearing scream of absolute psychological destruction. It was the sound of a woman plummeting headfirst into an endless, dark abyss. She dropped to her knees on the splintered wood of the entryway, clutching her head in her hands, wailing with a terrifying, agonizing intensity. She had spent her entire adult life looking down on people who struggled, believing her wealth and her status made her completely invincible. She had treated me like a disposable nuisance, a broken old man who existed only to fund her lavish arrogance. Now she was kneeling in the dirt, with absolutely $0 to her name, facing imminent homelessness and absolute public ruin. I looked down at her crying form and felt absolutely no pity. I had given her a fortress, and she had chosen to invite a parasite inside to slowly devour the foundation. She had chosen to smile while her husband threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward. She had made her choice, and now she was simply experiencing the flawless, mathematical consequence of a structural collapse. I stepped carefully around her trembling body, walked out the broken front door, and stepped into the cool evening air, leaving her entirely alone in the darkness to face the absolute devastation she had so eagerly helped create. The heavy mahogany doors of the county courthouse felt like the gates to an inevitable mathematical conclusion. I walked through the metal detectors at 8 o'clock in the morning, feeling the cold, polished marble floor beneath my shoes. I was wearing my best tailored charcoal suit, the one I had originally purchased for my late wife's funeral. I wore it today, not to mourn, but to bury the man who had tried to destroy my life. Frederick Crowe walked confidently beside me, carrying his thick leather briefcase like an executioner's axe. The hallways were crowded with frantic people, weeping families, and overworked public defenders shouting over the chaotic noise. I felt absolutely no anxiety. A structural engineer knows that once the demolition charges are perfectly placed inside a condemned building, the actual collapse is simply a matter of gravity. Today, we were going to pull the final trigger. We entered courtroom number 4 and took our seats in the second row of the heavy wooden gallery benches. The air inside the room was stale, and smelled faintly of floor wax and nervous sweat. I sat with my hands folded, resting on my lap, staring straight ahead at the raised judicial bench. 10 minutes later, the heavy side door connected to the holding cells swung open. A line of inmates shuffled into the room, bound together by thick steel chains around their waists and ankles. My eyes immediately locked onto the third man in the line. It was Bryce, the arrogant corporate executive who had kicked down my front door just a few days ago. Was completely unrecognizable. He was wearing a violently bright Orange County jail jumpsuit that hung loosely off his shoulders. His expensive haircut was a greasy, tangled mess. His face was pale and covered in a dark layer of coarse stubble. The reality of a cold concrete cell had entirely stripped away his polished financial armor. Bryce scanned the gallery with frantic, terrified eyes until he saw me sitting next to Frederick. A sudden flash of pure, desperate hatred crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with a pathetic look of victimhood. The bailiff ordered the inmates to sit on the designated wooden bench along the wall. The judge, a stern-looking man with silver hair and a completely exhausted expression, took his seat at the top of the bench and slammed his wooden gavel. He began calling the docket cases one by one. I watched Bryce nervously tapping his chained hands against his knees. He was entirely alone. Brianna was nowhere to be found in the courtroom gallery. She had completely abandoned him the moment she realized his financial empire had collapsed. When the clerk finally called Bryce's name, he stood up awkwardly, the heavy metal chains clanking loudly in the quiet room. A young, exhausted public defender stepped up to the podium to stand beside him. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the massive file sitting on his desk. He read the preliminary charges out loud into the microphone: grand theft auto, fleeing and eluding law enforcement, and violently resisting a lawful arrest. The judge asked the public defender how his client wished to plead to the arraignment charges. Before the young lawyer could even open his mouth to speak, Bryce committed the ultimate courtroom sin. He forcefully shoved his public defender aside and leaned directly into the microphone. His voice echoed through the high ceilings, shrill and completely unhinged. He loudly declared that the entire situation was a massive family misunderstanding. He pointed a shaking, chained finger directly at me sitting quietly in the gallery. Bryce told the judge that he was not a criminal, but a dedicated son-in-law trying to protect his sick, elderly father. He lied with the practiced ease of a corporate sociopath. He claimed that I had voluntarily given him the keys to the vintage muscle car as an early birthday present weeks ago. He swore to the court that my mind was rapidly deteriorating and that I had simply forgotten about the gift in a state of severe age-related confusion. He dramatically begged the judge to dismiss the grand theft auto charges immediately. He did not stop there. He attempted to execute the very threat he had made in my kitchen. He formally requested that the judge order an emergency psychiatric hold on me right there in the courtroom. He claimed he possessed a sworn medical affidavit proving my advanced dementia and demanded that the court immediately grant him temporary conservatorship over my estate to protect my assets from my own insanity. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The judge lowered his reading glasses, staring at Bryce with a look of deep, skeptical scrutiny. He then looked over at me, sitting perfectly still next to my attorney. Frederick Crowe did not wait for an invitation to speak. He stood up from the wooden bench, smoothed the front of his expensive suit jacket, and walked past the wooden swinging gate into the central well of the courtroom. He introduced himself to the judge as my retained legal counsel. Frederick spoke with a voice so calm and authoritative that it completely commanded the attention of every single person in the room. He told the judge that the defendant was indeed correct about one single fact. There was a medical document regarding my cognitive health. Frederick opened his leather briefcase and pulled out the thick, sealed envelope from the State Supreme Court Medical Board. He walked forward and handed it directly to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. Frederick respectfully asked the judge to review the certified results of the 4-hour intensive psychological and cognitive evaluation I had completed just 72 hours ago. He stated clearly for the official court record that I had scored in the 99th percentile for spatial reasoning logic and memory retention. He formally declared that the state-appointed medical board had legally certified me as completely mentally sound and entirely competent. I watched Bryce's pale face turn the color of wet ash. He stared at the thick white envelope in the judge's hands, realizing that his ultimate trump card had just been completely incinerated. The judge broke the seal and quickly scanned the official document, noting the 3 specialized doctor signatures and the raised state seal. The judge's expression shifted from exhausted skepticism to pure concentrated anger. He looked down at Bryce and asked him very quietly if he was in the habit of lying to a sitting magistrate in open court. Bryce began to stammer, stepping back from the microphone, his heavy chains rattling as panic completely overtook his nervous system. Frederick did not give Bryce a single second to recover his balance. He turned to the judge and delivered the final devastating blow. Frederick stated that the defendant was not just lying about a stolen vehicle to avoid a local felony conviction. Frederick informed the court that the defendant was currently the primary target of an active, massive federal bank fraud investigation. Frederick pulled out the certified forensic audit of the forged home equity line of credit and the printed alert of the failed offshore wire transfer to the Cayman Islands. He requested permission to submit the documents into evidence for the bail hearing. The judge immediately granted the request. Frederick explained the entire structural reality of Bryce's criminal enterprise to the court. He detailed how Bryce had forged my signature to steal $300,000 of my personal equity. He explained how Bryce had attempted to launder those stolen funds to an untraceable offshore account just hours before he forcefully broke into my home to steal a classic vehicle valued at $80,000. Frederick painted a flawless, undeniable picture of a desperate man whose financial crimes were catching up to him. He argued that Bryce stealing the car and attempting to flee from the highway patrol was a direct, calculated flight response to his failing offshore wire transfer. Frederick looked directly at the judge and delivered his final legal recommendation. He stated that a man facing decades in federal prison for aggravated identity theft and massive bank fraud, who had already demonstrated a violent willingness to flee from state law enforcement, and who possessed established connections to international offshore banking, could never be trusted to return for trial. Frederick formally requested that the court deny all forms of bail and remand the defendant to the county jail until his federal indictment was officially processed. Bryce began to scream. He thrashed against his heavy chains, screaming that the documents were fake and that Frederick was framing him. He yelled that he was a wealthy executive and demanded to be released immediately so he could go back to his massive house and his wife. He was completely delusional, unable to process the absolute finality of his own destruction. The 2 large bailiffs immediately stepped forward, grabbing Bryce by the shoulders and physically restraining him against the heavy wooden podium. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down so hard the sound echoed like a gunshot. The judge ordered Bryce to be absolutely silent or face an additional charge of contempt of court. The judge looked down at the forged banking documents and the certified medical affidavit. He looked at me sitting quietly in the gallery, recognizing the quiet dignity of a man who had simply refused to be a victim. The judge then looked at Bryce with an expression of absolute disgust. The judge leaned directly into his microphone and delivered the final, undeniable consequence. He stated that based on the irrefutable evidence of severe federal financial crimes, the violent nature of the physical arrest, and the undeniable flight risk posed by the defendant's own actions, he was officially declaring Bryce an extreme danger to the community and a catastrophic flight risk. The judge slammed the gavel down one final time. He revoked Bryce's bail entirely and ordered him to be held in maximum security county lockup without the possibility of bond until his trial date. The bailiffs immediately dragged Bryce away from the podium. He did not walk. He was physically hauled backward toward the heavy steel holding cell door. He looked over his shoulder at me, his eyes wide with absolute bottomless terror as the reality of his future finally crushed him. He was not going back to his granite countertops or his luxury vehicles. He was going to spend the next several years in a tiny concrete cage. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, cutting off his frantic screams entirely. I sat in the wooden pew, taking a slow, deep breath. The legal foundation of his life was completely demolished. Now there was only one loose end left to tie up before I could finally walk away entirely free. I stood up, buttoned my charcoal suit jacket, and walked out of the courtroom with my attorney ready to watch the final walls come crashing down on my ungrateful daughter. The 30 days expired exactly as I promised they would. On the morning of the 31st day, I parked my car across the street from the massive suburban estate I had once purchased for my daughter. The sun was barely rising over the horizon, but the quiet neighborhood was already completely awake. A convoy of heavy yellow industrial machinery was lined up along the curb. Massive bulldozers, excavators, and a commercial wrecking crew stood idling in the crisp morning air, their diesel engines rumbling with the promise of absolute destruction. A team of corporate lawyers in sharp suits stood at the end of the driveway, holding clipboards and the final writ of possession. The retail conglomerate did not operate on emotional timelines. They operated on strict financial schedules, and today was demolition day. I watched the heavy oak front door swing open. Brianna stumbled out onto the front porch, looking entirely disoriented and completely terrified. She had spent the last 30 days living in a state of deep denial, hoping the bank would miraculously save her, or that I would suddenly change my mind and cancel the corporate sale. But there was no salvation coming. The lead corporate attorney walked up the driveway and handed her the final eviction order. He calmly informed her that she had exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises before the demolition crew breached the structural walls. Brianna ran back inside the house in a blind, frantic panic. Because Bryce's federal fraud charges had permanently frozen every single bank account attached to their names, Brianna had no access to liquid cash. She could not hire a professional moving company to carefully pack her expensive crystal or transport her heavy luxury furniture. She could not even afford to buy basic cardboard boxes. I watched from across the street as she began dragging heavy black plastic garbage bags out the front door and dumping them unceremoniously onto the front lawn. She was frantically stuffing thousands of dollars worth of designer dresses, custom shoes, and expensive leather handbags into cheap disposable trash bags. The wealthy neighbors she used to host for her lavish dinner parties were now standing on their porches, watching her public humiliation unfold in real time. The wealthy socialite who used to mock my simple lifestyle was now sweating profusely, hauling garbage bags across the manicured grass, while the demolition crew watched her with bored indifference. When the 1-hour deadline expired, the foreman blew a loud air horn. The heavy yellow excavators began rolling up the driveway, their massive steel treads crushing the pristine landscaping. Brianna stood on the public sidewalk surrounded by a mountain of black plastic bags. She watched as the first excavator raised its massive steel claw and drove it straight through the front window of her expensive living room. The sound of shattering glass and tearing wood echoed through the neighborhood. The fortress she had used to justify her arrogance was violently reduced to a pile of worthless rubble in less than 20 minutes. I started my car engine and drove away, leaving her standing in the dust. 2 hours later, she called me from a borrowed cell phone, begging for one final meeting. I agreed to meet her at a cheap diner on the edge of the city. When she walked through the glass doors of the restaurant, she looked like a completely broken woman. Her designer clothes were covered in gray drywall dust. Her face was hollow and exhausted. She slid into the vinyl booth across from me and stared at her hands. The woman who once demanded a $10,000 cash deposit for a new luxury car was now sitting in a greasy diner begging for basic shelter. She did not offer a grand apology this time. She had finally run out of lies and manipulations. She simply looked up at me with empty, defeated eyes and begged for a loan. She whispered that she had managed to drag her trash bags to a cheap motel down the street, but she only had enough cash in her pocket to pay for 2 nights. She pleaded with me to lend her just $3,000 to secure a basic lease on a small one-bedroom apartment. She promised she would find a job and pay me back every single cent. She swore she had learned her lesson and that she just needed a tiny bit of help to survive the winter. She looked at me with the desperate, pleading expression of a starving animal hoping the father she had betrayed would offer her a final lifeline. I looked at my daughter sitting across the sticky diner table. I remembered the 3 years I spent living in her guest house. I remembered the absolute humiliation of asking her for basic groceries while she drained my monthly pension to fund her luxury vacations. I remembered opening my pantry to find 3 dented cans of generic soup. I did not raise my voice or offer a long, emotional lecture. I calmly reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my leather wallet. I extracted a single, crisp $20 bill. I placed the green paper flat on the table and slowly slid it across the surface until it touched her trembling fingertips. I looked directly into her eyes and told her that this was exactly the amount of money she deemed sufficient for my weekly survival. I told her that when she was in total control of my finances, she decided my comfort and my dignity were only worth $20 a week. I told her I was simply matching her standard of care. I stood up from the booth, adjusted my coat, and told her to spend the money wisely, because the gravy train had permanently derailed. I turned my back on her and walked out of the diner, leaving her sitting alone, staring at the $20 bill that represented the absolute totality of her remaining wealth. The federal sentencing took place 3 months later in a heavily guarded courtroom located in the center of the financial district. I sat in the very back row, wearing my dark tailored suit, and watched the final calculations of justice permanently balance themselves out. Bryce stood before the federal magistrate, completely stripped of his arrogant corporate armor. His expensive tailored suits and silk ties had been permanently replaced by the rough, scratchy fabric of a standard-issue bright Orange County jail uniform. His hands and ankles were bound in heavy steel chains that rattled loudly every time he shifted his weight. The judge read the formal federal indictment aloud for the official public record. The list of crimes was extensive and undeniable. The judge detailed the massive domestic bank fraud, the aggravated identity theft, and the highly violent attempted escape from state highway patrol officers. There was absolutely no leniency offered to a man who had attempted to steal an elderly man's life savings and launder it to the Cayman Islands. The judge struck the heavy wooden block with his gavel and handed down a mandatory sentence of 7 full years in a high-security federal penitentiary. The judge also ordered full financial restitution, ensuring that Bryce's wages would be garnished for the rest of his natural life upon his eventual release. He would never work in the financial sector again. He would be a convicted felon forever. I watched the armed federal marshals grab him by the shoulders and lead him through the heavy wooden side door toward the transport buses. He did not look back at me. I did not smile. I did not feel the sudden rush of vindictive triumph that men in movies often experience. I simply felt the quiet, profound satisfaction of watching a fundamentally broken structure safely demolished before it could cause any further collateral damage to the public. Brianna did not attend her husband's federal sentencing hearing. She was miles away, living the exact reality she had so carelessly tried to force upon me. My attorney, Frederick Crow, provided me with a final comprehensive status update regarding her situation before officially closing my legal case file. Brianna was currently residing in a small, dimly lit room at a cheap highway motel on the far industrial edge of the county line. The entitled woman who used to loudly complain about the specific temperature of her heated swimming pool was now sharing a broken communal laundry machine and sleeping on a sagging mattress that smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach. She was entirely and permanently cut off from the massive wealth she had attempted to steal. The luxury vehicles had been swiftly repossessed by the bank. Her designer clothes and expensive jewelry were slowly being sold to local pawn shops just to cover the weekly cost of her motel rent and basic generic groceries. Frederick informed me she had recently secured entry-level employment, working the late evening shift at a local discount retail store. She was finally learning the true heavy value of $1 by standing on a concrete floor for 8 hours a day, dealing with rude customers and a strict, unforgiving store manager. I knew that every single time she looked at her meager minimum wage paycheck, she would immediately remember the single $20 bill I had slid across the sticky diner table. She had willingly traded a father who loved her and a multi-million-dollar private estate for a greedy, arrogant criminal who ultimately left her with absolutely nothing. I did not feel the need to drive past her motel to gloat. I did not send her a mocking letter. I was a man who had completely severed a toxic, infected limb from his own body. I was simply moving forward with my life. I returned to my property one final time. The massive suburban estate was entirely gone. The commercial retail developers had worked with terrifying mechanical efficiency. The ground where the main house once stood was now a perfectly leveled expanse of flattened dirt and heavy crushed gravel waiting for the concrete foundation of a massive new shopping center. I walked into the small, ruined guest house and looked at the broken front door and the overturned furniture Bryce had destroyed. I did not bother trying to repair the physical damage. I did not pack the old, heavy engineering textbooks or the cheap ceramic coffee mugs. I opened a thick leather duffel bag and packed only what truly mattered. I packed my best clothes, my passport, and the original leather key fob to my late wife's pristine, vintage muscle car, which was now resting safely in a high-security, climate-controlled storage facility downtown. I zipped the bag shut and walked out of the guest house for the very last time. I did not look back at the empty property as the hired car drove me away. I instructed the driver to take me directly to the international airport. I walked up to the premium service counter and handed the ticketing agent my passport. I had spent 40 long years saving my money, investing wisely, and sacrificing my own personal comfort for the sake of my family. The time for endless sacrifice was officially over. I purchased a first-class one-way ticket to Rome. The experience of walking onto that massive airplane was unlike anything I had ever felt in my entire 69 years of life. I settled into the wide, luxurious leather seat of the private first-class cabin. A flight attendant with a warm, genuine smile brought me a steaming hot towel and a crystal glass of sparkling water. As the massive jet engines roared to life and lifted the heavy aircraft off the runway, I looked out the small window at the sprawling city shrinking rapidly below me. I was leaving behind the bitter betrayal, the blind greed, and the exhausting legal battles. I was leaving behind a daughter who had chosen to view my quiet kindness as a pathetic weakness. I was flying directly toward an entirely blank canvas. I drank a cup of dark, rich coffee as we crossed the vast blue expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. I spent the entire 10-hour flight reading a brilliant historical novel and sleeping peacefully without a single anxious thought about frozen bank accounts or pending court dates. When we finally landed in Italy, the warm, golden Mediterranean air greeted me like an old, familiar friend. I did not book a temporary hotel room. I had already authorized my wealth management firm to purchase a beautiful, secluded stone villa nestled high in the rolling green hills of the Tuscan countryside. A private driver met me at the airport terminal and drove me through miles of ancient silver olive groves and vibrant sunlit vineyards. The ancient architecture of the Italian region spoke directly to my deep engineering soul. I saw massive stone bridges and tall arched aqueducts that had stood completely intact for over 2,000 years. They were built on solid, unyielding foundations, crafted by brilliant men who fundamentally understood the absolute value of permanent structural strength. We arrived at my new private home just as the bright evening sun began to set behind the distant mountains. The villa was incredibly magnificent. It featured thick, heavy stone walls, dark oak ceiling beams, and tall, spotless glass windows that offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the ancient valley below. The property was completely isolated, far away from the loud noise and the chaotic, demanding pressure of modern society. I carried my single leather bag inside and walked directly out onto the wide stone terrace. The cool evening air was crisp and smelled heavily of crushed sweet grapes and wild blooming lavender. I walked over to a small, heavy wooden table and poured myself a large glass of vintage red wine from a locally sourced bottle. I held the heavy crystal glass up to the fading sunlight, watching the deep, rich, ruby color perfectly catch the fading light. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The taste was incredibly rich, highly complex, and absolutely perfect. I sat down in a comfortable woven chair and listened to the natural environment surrounding me. There were no arrogant sons-in-law demanding my money or threatening my freedom. There were no ungrateful daughters complaining about the temperature of their luxury vehicles. There were no empty threats, no legal ultimatums, and absolutely no lies. There was only the gentle, soothing sound of the evening wind moving quietly through the old olive trees and the distant rhythmic chirping of the night crickets. The silence inside my beautiful empty home was absolute and profound. It was not the cold, terrifying silence of a forgotten old man waiting to die in a ruined guest house. It was the warm, golden silence of a resilient man who had successfully defended his own life and secured his own future. And to you listening to this story, remember this. I was not defeated by greed. I was awakened by it. In this family story, I learned that love without boundaries becomes permission for abuse. I should have acted sooner. I should have questioned sooner. Don't be like me, don't wait until disrespect becomes normal. In many grandpa stories, we're told to endure silently. But silence is not holiness. God gave us wisdom. God gave us dignity. And God did not design us to fund our own humiliation. If someone treats your kindness as weakness, believe them the first time. This family story is not just about money. It's about self-respect. These grandpa stories remind us that age is not fragility. It is clarity earned through storms. I once believed sacrifice was proof of love. I was wrong. Love without accountability destroys foundations. My personal view: forgiveness is powerful, but consequences are necessary. In this family story, I chose justice over guilt. In these grandpa stories, we see that strength in old age is not physical, it is moral. If this message spoke to you, share where you're listening from in the comments. Like and subscribe if you believe respect must be mutual. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. And a gentle note: upcoming stories may include certain fictional elements crafted for reflection and education. If that's not for you, feel free to explore other content that better fits your preferences.